For most people, the ancient world is a collection of myths, kings with long beards, clay tablets, gods with animal heads, dusty ruins left behind by civilizations that vanished thousands of years ago. But there's a truth hiding inside those ruins, a truth most people never learned, because it doesn't fit the way we're used to thinking about history. Before Wall Street, before central banks, before taxes, before the idea of the economy even existed, there were temples. And for nearly 2,000 years, the gods of Mesopotamia controlled the first real financial system in human history. Nothing is ever as simple as it looks. If you've ever wondered how our modern financial world came to be, how credit emerged, how wages began, how contracts were invented, how institutions gained the authority to run economies, you need to go back to ancient Mesopotamia. The region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in what is now Iraq, Kuwait, and parts of Syria. A place historians call the cradle of civilization. But it wasn't civilization alone that took shape there. It was something more subtle and far more influential. The temple economy. It's hard for a modern viewer to imagine this system because we tend to separate religion and finance into opposite worlds. We pray in one, we bank in the other. But in early cities like Uruk, Lagash, Ur, Babylon, and Nippur, the boundary didn't exist. The temple wasn't just a shrine. It wasn't a quiet spiritual refuge where priests whispered prayers in candlelight. It was the central bank, the landlord, the corporation, the employer, the vault, the regulator, the tax office, all fused into one institution, towering over the city. And this wasn't a side feature of the ancient world. This was the ancient world. You could say that the gods of Mesopotamia were the world's first federal reserve and the priests were the first financial administrators. To understand why temples became economic powerhouses, you have to remember how chaotic early city life was. Ancient Mesopotamia wasn't a unified nation. It wasn't a peaceful landscape dotted with small villages. It was a collection of fiercely independent city-states, often competing for resources, trading over long distances, vulnerable to droughts, floods, and invasions. There was no strong secular government, no tax department, no standing bureaucracy. But the temples, they had everything a financial system needs: land, labor, storage, literacy, legitimacy, and most importantly, trust. When you tell people your institution is run by the gods, compliance becomes surprisingly efficient. So, let's step inside one of these temples, not the ruins we see today, but the living, breathing economic engine that once dominated the ancient world. Imagine a city like Uruk around 3000 BCE. Life centers around the Great Ziggurat, a multi-layered structure rising above the skyline. At the top is the shrine to the city's god, but everything below it is the heartbeat of the economy. Priests and scribes walk through courtyards with tablets of clay, tracking incoming grain, counting livestock, allocating rations, recording labor contracts. Warehouses store mountains of barley, the lifeblood of the temple's accounting system. Workshops buzz with textile production. Farmers haul in part of their harvest as temple rent. Shepherds deliver wool and sheep. Metalworkers turn copper into tools. Caravans prepare for expeditions, financed and approved by temple administrators. This was not just religion. This was the earliest form of organized economic life on Earth. The first financial mechanism built. Inside this system was land ownership. Temples owned vast territories. Legally, the land belonged to the gods, meaning priests managed it on their behalf. Farmers didn't own their fields. They leased them from the temple and paid rent in the form of grain, labor, or livestock. This wasn't taxation in the modern sense, but functionally, it worked the same way. The temple extracted a share of production and redistributed it to workers, officials, and dependents. From the land came the labor system. Temples employed thousands of people: field workers, builders, herders, weavers, potters, brewers, metalworkers, scribes, guards, priests, midwives, and more. In some cities, the temple payroll was so massive it eclipsed every other economic actor combined. These workers were paid in standardized rations of grain, beer, and oil, carefully measured and recorded. This is why early writing evolved not for poetry or myth but for accounting. The earliest clay tablets are not stories about heroes, they're receipts. There's a dry irony here. For all the mythology, Mesopotamian civilization wasn't built on epic tales, it was built on spreadsheets. But the innovation didn't stop with wages. Temples also acted as banks. Their warehouses held citywide reserves of grain, silver, and goods. People stored their surplus in the temple because it was secure, protected, and managed by literate scribes. This storage system led naturally to lending. When farmers experienced crop failures or merchants needed barley for trade expeditions, they borrowed from the temple with interest. And if the idea of paying interest to a god feels intimidating, that was the point. In a world without credit scores or collateral, divine authority did the job. These loans were recorded on clay tablets with astonishing detail. quantities, due dates, obligations, penalties. Some tablets even show early forms of compound interest. The temple became the financial center not because it was good at praying, but because it was the only institution strong enough to coordinate economic life across thousands of people. Weighing stations inside the temple complex enforced standard measurements, a crucial step toward consistent trade. If you've ever wondered why civilizations developed systems of standardized weights, units, and measures, the answer is simple. It made temple accounting easier. By the mid-3rd millennium BCE, temples were effectively corporations. They financed large-scale irrigation projects that required coordination across entire regions. They sponsored long-distance trade caravans that traveled hundreds of miles into Anatolia, Iran, and the Persian Gulf. They managed a city's labor, redistributed surplus during droughts, and maintained records that functioned as legal documents. This wasn't a religious economy. This was religion as economy. But the most important thing to remember, and the idea that sets us up for the second half of this story, is that this system wasn't perfect. It wasn't stable forever. And it didn't always work in the ways the priests wanted it to. Power attracts power struggles. Surplus attracts corruption. And no financial system is immune to political pressure. Because eventually, kings appeared, and they wanted control of the same wealth that temples had built. As temple economies grew wealthier and more sophisticated, something inevitable happened. Political leaders noticed. Kings in ancient Mesopotamia were not absolute rulers in the modern sense. They rose and fell. They needed legitimacy. And the place where legitimacy lived was the temple. If you wanted to rule, you needed the gods on your side, or at least the priests who spoke for them. But beneath the spiritual language was something more practical. Kings needed the resources the temples controlled: land, grain, labor, silver, storage, scribes, and trusted administrators. In other words, the financial system. So the story shifts. From temples building the first economy to kings trying to take it over. Around 2350 BCE, a ruler named Sargon of Akkad began doing something revolutionary. He transferred the temple's economic power into the hands of the monarchy. He conquered Sumerian cities, seized their temple wealth, and integrated it into a centralized state. His strategy was simple. If the temples controlled the economy, and he controlled the temples, then he controlled the economy. It worked for a while, but it also introduced a new tension that would define Mesopotamian politics for centuries. The struggle between religious economic power and secular political power. Temples wanted autonomy. Kings wanted revenue. And in a world, what we now call public finance was really a negotiation over who got access to the offerings, rents, and storehouses of the gods. This pressure created one of the most fascinating developments in early economic history: royal debt cancellation. If you think modern governments manipulate financial systems for political gain, Mesopotamian kings were already masters of the trick. Whenever debt spiraled, whenever peasants lost their land, whenever inequality threatened stability, a king could issue a clean slate decree, a literal wiping out of debts, interest, and obligations. Some scholars call this the earliest version of a bailout, but unlike today, it wasn't banks being bailed out, it was the people. The logic was simple. If too many farmers became indebted to wealthy elites or temples, they would be forced into servitude. If that happened, the king lost taxpayers, soldiers, and stability. So the king cancelled the debts. Not out of kindness, out of economic self-preservation. It's worth pausing to appreciate how modern this sounds. A financial crisis emerges. The state steps in, debts are wiped to preserve the system, and then everything starts again. History doesn't repeat, but the financial playbook does. As centuries passed, temples and kings developed a shared but uneasy partnership. Temples still managed the majority of economic administration. They employed scribes who maintained the first bureaucracies. They handled redistribution during famine. They coordinated large-scale labor projects like irrigation. They made loans and collected interest. But kings increasingly pulled surplus into palace accounts, took control of trade routes, and used temple wealth to fund armies. You could say that Mesopotamia invented not only the first economy, but the first state takeover of an economy. And within this evolving structure, something remarkable took shape. The earliest form of the state as we know it, a state that collects resources, redistributes them, controls infrastructure, regulates trade, records data, enforces contracts, all functions inherited directly from the temple economy. If you strip away the mythology, what's left is a machine, a system built not on belief alone, but on administration, writing, storage, accounting, labor, surplus, the spine of civilization. But this system wasn't invincible. Temples were powerful but not magical. Kings were ambitious, but not all-powerful. And Mesopotamia itself was volatile. Floods, droughts, invasions, and political fragmentation constantly threatened the balance. When debts grew too large, or when temple elites concentrated too much wealth, inequality spread. Social unrest followed, and economic collapse became unavoidable. One of the earliest examples comes from around 2200 BCE at the end of the Akkadian Empire. A combination of drought, over-centralization, and administrative failures caused famine and social breakdown. Temples could no longer manage redistribution. Kings could no longer enforce debt fairness. The system fractured, and for centuries afterward, Mesopotamian city-states oscillated between temple dominance and royal dominance, always trying to avoid the economic extremes that toppled their predecessors. And that's where the story becomes surprisingly contemporary. Because if you look at our modern financial world, central banks, bureaucracies, tax systems, national reserves, public works, legal codes, you're not looking at inventions of the last few centuries. You're looking at an ancient, operating system created by temples 5,000 years ago and upgraded by kings. Temples owning land becomes modern governments owning public land, infrastructure, and natural resources. Temple lending becomes banking. Temple rations become wages. Temple storage becomes national grain reserves and strategic stockpiles. Temple accounting becomes bureaucracy. Temple ideology becomes political legitimacy, the idea that our institutions work because we believe they work. And beneath it all is the same truth. Economies aren't built on markets, they're built on institutions capable of organizing human behavior at scale. Temples did it first, states took it next. Corporations do it now, which brings us to our present dilemma. We like to imagine that modern economies are purely rational, purely financial, purely data-driven. But the temple economy shows us something uncomfortable. Economic power is never just economic. It's cultural, psychological, ideological. People trusted the temples not because they understood accounting but because they believed the gods were watching. Today, people trust currencies, banks, laws, and governments for reasons just as intangible. Confidence, legitimacy, story, money, in every age, relies on belief. So what is the lesson hiding beneath the ruins of Mesopotamian temples? It's simple and unsettling. Our financial systems were born inside institutions that mixed power, belief, and administration. Separate the belief from the institution, and the system collapses. Abuse the power, and the system collapses. Lose the administrative discipline, and the system collapses. Ancient Mesopotamia learned this the hard way through debt crises, inequality, political upheaval, and economic resets. And although the world has changed, the mechanics haven't. Today's financial world still runs on the foundations they built. Temples became states. Scribes became bureaucrats. Grain accounts became balance sheets. Ritual became legitimacy. And our system evolved from there. History doesn't repeat, but if you don't understand it, it'll crush you all the same. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.